Tonight, I'm assuming most of you are going to be able to be here for this evening, be here tomorrow, because what I've done, there's 10 sessions, 2 of them are going to be Q&A, but the content sessions, believe it or not, you may not be able to tell right away, they do have interrelationships with each other. Tonight is going to be more or less some things of an apologetic bent. We will get some of that, of course, tomorrow as well. Tomorrow will be the really biblical stuff. This is going to be, biblical related tonight because of just issues like worldview and how to think well. And I hope, again, just giving you a little bit of insight as to how our culture has found itself in its mess. One of its messes is just the propensity really to think poorly, generally, and to also think poorly about anything that you sort of put in the traditional Judeo-Christian bucket. Okay, there are reasons for that. And so I want to talk about some of those things broadly, and then kind of steer the discussion into how, popular culture sort of peddles certain ideas. I think the big takeaway that I'd like you to come away with tonight is that what you and I are prone to consider harmless entertainment is really more than entertainment to lots of people. Now, I'm not going to say that you can't watch, Star Wars and the Avengers and things like this, and you shouldn't do that as a Christian and what. I'm not going to say anything like that, because if you think well, you know what entertainment is, and you can look at something and sort of parse where it's coming from. But a lot of people just can't do that, and they're trained not to do that. And when it comes to truth, anything again that you put in the Judeo-Christian theological bucket, they are actually trained to sort of either be apathetic toward that or really hostile. And so we want to talk about, again, this concatenation of ideas as to, why are people thinking the way they're thinking? What makes them prone, to do this? And then how popular culture really sweeps in to reinforce these things. And in some cases, for those of you who might have seen on my presentations online from Future Congress a couple of years ago about how pop culture sort of peddles the idea of utopia, there are some instances where this is quite deliberate. There are other instances where it's just not, it's sort of unconscious. The reason that film and TV and whatnot is what it is because the people who create the material, that's where they are. And they're not being militant about it, but it just is what it is. But in other cases, there is an agenda. So I want to try to introduce sort of the spectrum, the concatenation of those ideas to you tonight, and give you a little insight as to how I think about them. And some of what you'll hear, you'll sort of be able to plug in mentally to when you might have heard me on the radio. There are going to be a few things I think that would help orient you. By the way, my slides are really not this boring. I only have 2 that don't have any color, and it's these 2. I am aesthetically challenged, but I'm a little bit beyond this. But my general approach, and what I want you to try to go away with, is when you get into a conversation with someone who just not only won't accept the gospel or won't accept truth claims about Scripture or some other theological point that's important to the core of the faith, even beyond that, when they just sort of are prone to not really think that really anything's true at all, and they want to either peddle that idea on you or some other really strange idea. My approach is, look, show me the data. I want you to be data-driven, and I'm going to impress that upon you. It's about quantifying what it is you're asking me to believe. Because when you get into these conversations with people at work, even at church, really, but just sort of out about in life, and they're not accepting what you're saying, what in many cases, they want to convert you. They want you to be on their side. They want to win you over. They want you to agree with them. And they need to know that in order for that to happen, they need to have something to say. It's not sufficient that they just believe something. You want to know why they believe it. So I want to impress, again, on you that you need to be data-driven. I'm big on primary sources. Don't tell me what somebody said, show me. If it's an ancient text, and this usually kills the conversation, give me the citation number, give me the chapter and verse, give me the line of that tablet, and I'll go look. And if you're right, well, then we can further the discussion. But usually people are just passing on things that they've heard. So it's important, again, to take people back and get them to realize that, especially if they can't produce it, well, maybe this thing I believe is sort of like a vacuum. There's just nothing there. So that's an important idea. Context is always important for what they do talk about. Coherence, I'm really big on that. What you say needs to make sense. The fact that you can say it and present it to me as a worldview doesn't mean that I'm either impressed or even interested, because if it doesn't make sense, I don't know how you're going to convince me that I should adopt it and hang anything in my life on it. And right away, again, in this culture, we're going to talk about the whole postmodern mindset. Well, Mike, you're just operating from that elitist white European Western system of logic. Okay, just trust me on this. The best thing to say to that person is, well, what other system of logic would you like to have a conversation in? Because if you're opposed to logic, you can't have a conversation that makes sense about anything. I could just give you the names of my dog and cat for the rest of the afternoon, and that qualifies because we're having a conversation. Okay, you need to make sense in what you say, how you say it, why you're saying it. It's not adequate just to have something to say. And you need to insist upon that, and do it nicely. Okay? You also need to play fair. If you're going to insist upon these things from other people, for what they want you to believe, you need to be able to do the same. It's just courtesy. So with that said, let's get into a little bit about postmodernism. I'm going to wet my whistle here a little bit. Now, this is a term that we've all probably heard. And I'm going to suggest to you it really means two different things. I'm going to leave that unbuttoned. Postmodern, neo-pagan, post-Christian. These are overlapping but not necessarily synonymous terms, and we'll talk about why tonight. There are lots of worldviews out there, we know this. There are secular people that just don't believe anything about reality beyond the material world as science tells us it exists. We know that. You have book religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism. Again, their theology is oriented to a specific book that they hold as sacred. Then there are spirituality people. They don't care about anything written in terms of a book to follow. They're more or less about looking inward, mystical experience, sort of inner knowledge, their own experience, that sort of thing. And there's really no boundaries, there's really no rules. And then you have NRMs, new religious movements and cults. Now, they all compete for space, but there are certain core ideas that drive them. And one of these is pluralism. Anyone who, I think if any of you have been paying popular or attention to popular discourse in the last 20 years, okay, it has become the mainstream idea that everybody with something to say deserves to be heard and they deserve to be given equal status. Okay, it's just, it's wrong to insist that someone's wrong and someone over here is right. There's this inclination to essentially try to affirm everyone. Okay, didn't used to be that way, but it's more and more part of our culture. Now, in Christianity, this cultural shift has led to something that, again, is sort of a little nebulous term, the emergent church. And I'm not here to pick on the emergent church necessarily. There are good aspects of what is called emergent church, and there are bad aspects. We're going to talk a little bit about specifics tonight, but the good part of it is we want to think well to this cultural audience, to this time period, to this wider culture. We want to be able to think well and connect with them about truth and about the way we should live without giving up orthodoxy. So there's this churches everywhere have this internal turmoil and debate about how to reach the next generation, how to reach this generation, how to reach the young people, how to reach anybody under 50, that sort of thing. And it's because of these cultural shifts. So those are good questions to ask. They're important because they're real. There's another side to this, though, that really has altered the meaning of Christianity, where truth is something that's inward. Again, it's experience-oriented. We don't really do theology. We do social justice, that kind of thing. Now, I'm not saying, hey, Mike, I don't want anybody going away and saying, Mike said it's a good idea to treat people badly, or Mike is just thrilled that we have all these social problems and he just thinks they're great. Okay, that is not the point at all. I'm not a believer that it's a good thing that the church hands over ministry to people to the government. That is a huge mistake. But that's really where we find ourselves. Someone else will take care of that problem or that person, and our minds immediately go to welfare, some government program. Put a label on it. There's something that exists for all of it. The church has abandoned its responsibility in the world at that point. But that is not an argument for not caring about doctrine. Okay, that is not an argument that we can just sort of set aside because we assume people in our congregation are content intolerant, that we're not going to talk about theology. We're not going to do theology here. We're going to do works. Why does it have to be either? Okay, well, it's not an either-or situation, or at least it shouldn't be. So that's not where I'm going. What I want to go to, though, is, again, sort of the intellectual side of it. How in the world how did this mind shift happen? And that brings us into this whole thing called postmodernism. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that there are two ways to look at this term. One is historical, the other one is where we're living right now. And in the words of the great philosopher Boromir, one does not simply define postmodernism. See, if you haven't seen the movie, this is just not effective. But who has not seen? Don't answer that. Okay. There's this thing about you can't really define postmodernism. I get that. I understand it, but I'm going to disagree with it a little bit. I think you can describe it. Postmodernism is a reaction against, drum roll please, modernism. You say, well, what's modernism? Well, modernism is the modern mind. Well, what's the modern mind? And really what it's reacting to is not only the way modern thought has sort of propelled Western culture and Western civilization, but also that Western culture assumed certain certainties about life, about knowledge, about reality, about the way things are. So a person today, for some reason, again, we'll see why, really objects to the idea of scientific omniscience and human progress. These are myths to them. Science can be wrong. Science is not about truth. It is about discovering things that are real. But it's not omniscient. Nothing is. Nothing can be certain. Human progress is an illusion. It's something we talk about that never happens. Truth propositions. There are no such things to the postmodern. Nothing you can say is universally true. It's not true in all times and all circumstances for all people. They reject that idea. Well, that idea is really core to Christianity and Christian ethics. And so they reject religious Christian truth claims. Just don't want to hear about it. Don't want to hear about it at all. What they're really shooting at is epistemic certainty. Epistemology is the study, the philosophy of how we know things. And so they're saying, look, nobody can know anything with certainty at any point. So don't talk to me about Jesus. Don't talk to me about anything that will require me to say, this is true and this other stuff isn't. Okay, just culturally, there's been a shift that has led to that point. This is not new. Okay, this is actually good news. This is not something that just sort of sprang up. The term itself, coined in 1979, that's new, but this has been happening really since, I would put it, at the 16th century. The modern era, as historians, if you went to take a college course on history of Civ, the modern era begins after the Renaissance. Why is that? It was in the 1500s that we have the age of exploration. Europeans getting in boats, crossing lots of stretches, miles of water, and discovering what? New worlds. New people. How'd they get there? Are they really even people? Okay, that whole question. The age of exploration wasn't just crossing the Atlantic, it was going to places like India, China, a little bit earlier than this. Okay, it was only the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, where people really got a grasp of what happened in antiquity in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and that's because the languages were deciphered and translated, and we get to read what those people thought about creation, about how humans got here, about how old their own civilization was. Okay, all of these sorts of things that really derive from the simple act of mostly Europeans, again, China was some part of this as well, but getting in boats and just going places and discovering things, bringing them back, and eventually we uncover, here's the point, knowledge that isn't in the Bible. Okay, think about where you are in Europe in the 16th century. This is the 1500s. You've had 1,000 years or more of one institution telling you what is truth, the Catholic Church. Okay? Now you had a Reformation in 1517 and thereabouts, and a little later in Geneva, Switzerland, and Scotland, and some of these other places. So a few bumps on the road, but it's still, again, oriented around the Bible. Okay, when you start discovering other things, and again, being able to read their own literature, their own primary sources, all this stuff, and this stuff ain't in there, it creates a bit of a crisis. What do we do? How do we look at the Bible anymore? How do we look at its truth claims, its truth assertions? How do we think rightly about it now? And of course, if you didn't like the Bible to begin with, this is a great opportunity. It's like, yeah, this is like ammunition. I've been waiting for this day. Now I'm going to use it to, go shoot it at the Bible. Darwin sort of goes without saying. Darwin publishes in the mid-1800s, 1859, Origin of Species. Okay, that, again, converges with, again, some of the expansion, the explosion of all this knowledge that isn't in the Bible. So that doesn't help, again, when the Christian person stands up and says, this is true, this is not. Okay, you also have, a little later on in the late 1800s, early 20th century, I have here in the notes, Einstein and relativity versus Newton. Do you realize, this might sound foreign, but do you realize that up until Einstein, he's the one that gets credit for it, but up until the people working in theoretical physics associated with Einstein in the early 20th century, everybody thought that Newton had the way the universe ran nailed. If you think back, way back into your history of Civ course, you might have, either in high school or college, you might remember the phrase clockwork universe. Okay, that was Newton. Newton came up with mathematical formulas that explained everything, and astronomers were a big deal. They were the celebrities of the age because they figured out all sorts of things. This is why we were able to do navigation, centuries prior to this. Mathematicians, astronomers figured out, based upon astronomy, how to detect your location at any given point on the globe. You didn't just go Google, hey, where's Google Earth here? I'm lost in the Atlantic. Okay, you don't do that. Everything is based upon naked eye observation and math. And they were the celebrities of their age. And Newton is sort of the capstone of all this. And so by the time you get to Newton, everything is figured out. Well, not really. Einstein comes along and comes up with this crazy idea that things like space and time are relative. Theory of relativity. And when he's right, and when other physicists start doing crazy things like proving that, something happens to this particle over here, and a million miles away, that its counterpart particle, the distance doesn't matter. It's affected by this, and they're sort of connected, but there's nothing connecting them, but yet that's what we see. That's just weird. Okay, in modern cosmology, that's spooky distance. If you wanted to Google that, you could look it up. All sorts of really strange things that Newton could not explain and really couldn't even imagine. Now, when that happened, people are like, well, what else don't we know? What else isn't certain? I mean, if even things like space and time are like, could be this, could be that, what else is there? Because you got Darwin in the life sciences, now you got theory of relativity, and people are just wondering, how do we know what's real? And not only that, but then they're going back to the Bible and saying, look at all this stuff these guys are digging up. That they're proving, that they're discovering. I don't see the Bible talking about any of this stuff. Again, fascism and nationalism. I don't want to say too much about this, but basically when you go through a few world wars, the phrase human progress doesn't mean a whole lot. There was just, again, this feeling that we're never going to sort of turn the corner on utopia or even really people treating each other the way they ought to be treated. And some of that is an outgrowth of Darwin and some of these other things, because once you start to lose the idea of the sanctity of life, oh, well, it's a statistic. For progress, lots of people have to die. It's just, life is tough. Survival of the fittest, all that kind of thing. Just applied to humanity. So there are lots of forces going on from, within this thing we know as the modern world all the way into the 20th century. And the 20th century is when all this stuff starts to hit, critical mass. And there's this shift where really, if you're living in the mid 20th century and beyond, you are post-modernity just by being alive. Your world is not the world of people living a few hundred years ago. They were certain about lots of things. But now, lots of people are not certain about lots of things. And you add to it this thing we call the internet, where in the 1950s, if somebody had a religious or theological question, who would they go ask? Johnny comes home from school and says, hey, this popped into my head while I was studying, and I have this question. They're going to ask mom or dad, maybe the grandparents, or the pastor. Okay, those are the gatekeepers of knowledge in a bygone era. Who are the gatekeepers of knowledge now? Google, YouTube, just these portals where, you might stumble across something good there. If you go to my website, you of course will. But you find a lot of bad stuff too. A lot of just either misinformed nonsense or downright hostile material. But those are the gatekeepers of knowledge. And so there's this constant exposure and really overexposure to ideas that are very much in the stream of our culture that rejects things like certainties in anything, that rejects the idea that there are truth statements to make that are really true, and they're always true. people grow up unaccustomed to that idea. And, as Christians, we can, instruct our children, try to get the point across that, hey, there are some things that really are true and will always be true. And, let's talk about some of those things in our churches and whatnot. But I think we've all of us could probably come up with some anecdotal story that in our efforts to try to reach the culture, the unchurched culture, that we can minimize the need to just think well about theology, to think well about why we have different worldviews, and to really sort of know kind of how to approach someone who really just grew up in this. If we're not telling our people how to do that, or even that they ought to do it, that it's important. It's not just important that someone come to church and have a good time and meet somebody and form a relationship. Church should not be intentionally boring. Okay, relationships should not be ridiculed and shunned. Okay, I'm not saying any of those things. But if that's all that happens, then you are forfeiting your status as a gatekeeper of knowledge to the people in your congregation. People you know in church, people you know outside church. You are just forfeiting that role. And frankly, you're just telling them, go YouTube it. See what you find there. It's just not a good thing. Now, what we're used to thinking, again, is, hey, postmodernism means things just aren't the way they used to be. And that's true. But it's a lot more complicated than that. Again, people they're at the place where they throw off traditional religious ideas. They embrace evolution in some form. And I'm not saying that's a necessary evil. If what evolutionary theory says is correct, well, then it's true, because why? Because this is the way God made the world, okay? I'm not here to argue about evolution. I know Christians, really good, committed Christians on all sides, and there's more than two sides of that debate. That's sort of incidental, because you can do that and still do theology. But again, since that's a big part of our culture, you need to become conversant into what it says and what it doesn't say and all that sort of thing. And again, embracing science that's just sort of feeds off uncertainty. Where it's led is that there's almost a militant skepticism in our culture today. And that's really what people get currently if you go off to your college classroom and your philosophy professor or someone else starts talking about postmodernism. It's this extreme sort of radicalized skepticism and antipathy toward anyone else who's not skeptical. You can talk about truth all you want, but if you claim to have discovered any, then you're like a target. Okay? So that's where it's gone. People today, at least many of them, think that only what is discoverable is true. So they'll look at science and say science is not synonymous with truth, but it detects truth now and again. And so we need to pay attention to what science says, because they're busy discovering things that are true. And it could be wrong. We can't assign omniscience and certainty to it. But it's trying to do the job. Whereas they'll look at theology, religion, and saying basically everything you people are saying is not discoverable. You just have to sort of believe it or not. And when the debate is cast and framed in that way, don't you just feel like, some of you, are probably thinking, well, maybe there's some truth to that. But don't think that. Don't allow them to frame the debate that way. But I'm telling you, this is how it's framed. Only that which is discoverable by the human senses and human procedures, the rational mind, the tools of science, that's the only stuff that's true. That in and of itself is a presupposition. That is an assumption. Okay? But this is why people are intellectually inclined in that direction. Because they have been fed this idea. It can only be true if it's discoverable by tools that we can actually utilize and use, people we call scientists. We're not going to make them magicians anymore. We're not going to make them high priests and just say whatever you say is absolutely certain, because you could be wrong, but you're at least trying to lead us to the right path. You're at least trying to do something that's discoverable. So when you go down that path, that means theological ideas, ethical ideas that stem from a Judeo-Christian worldview, which is really sort of driven by the idea that there is a God and that God has certain expectations of humanity. And if God isn't discoverable through science, then they're going to say, look, the bottom just fell out of what you believe, because they frame the discussion that way. There goes your ethics. Don't tell me that there's absolutes in ethics because God cares if you do this, or A or B, or X or Y. What you're saying that I need to believe in is not discoverable. Again, they're continually framing the issue that way. And pop culture drives people this way. Any movie that has the scientist as a hero and the person who believes something that's not discoverable is the doofus, okay, or the someone who just gets shown to be wrong in the end. That reinforces the idea. Okay. Now, a lot of people are really forced into a decision then. Is there a reality beyond science? Some will just say, forget it, no. And they're going to be the atheist, materialist kind of person. There is no reality beyond the material world, and science is trying to figure out how it works. It's trying to discover it for us. That's it. Draw the line right there. Then you'll have other people that say, well, I'm not really sure about that. And then you have to ask yourself, well, why isn't that person sure? Why am I not sure? Why, you person I'm talking to, why aren't you sure? And in the old days, it would be something like, well, because the Bible tells me so, or because I read this in the Bible, or my pastor said this, or this isn't the way my parents taught me. Well, now, again, in the absence, we've had this cultural shift. And this message has been beaten into the minds of so many. If you're not an atheist materialist, there are multitudes of people around you at work, and yes, even in your church and in your own family, that the only reason they're not that is because of some experience they've had, or an experience that someone else has had that they know and trust. It has nothing to do with rational theological articulation. They want to be spiritual. This is what people mean when they talk about spirituality. I want to believe that there's something beyond this world, but I don't want a pope or any religious authority telling me it is. I'm just not interested in any authoritative teaching. What I'm interested in is my own experience of someone else, something anomalous in life that science really doesn't have, nailed down. That convinces me that there's something else out there. And I'm going to do what I can, maybe through meditation, maybe through reading, maybe through listening to lectures or podcasts. I'm going to do what I can to sort of learn about the mystery that's out there and that's within. So in other words, it gets what fills the gap is not the notion of biblical authority. It's not the notion of any authority. The authority becomes me, you. Again, driven by experience and things that you can't explain and don't know that anyone else can. And so that keeps you going. And for some people, it drives them and compels them to all sorts of really strange beliefs. Later on tonight, we'll get into some of those. Just what people sort of replace God with, what they replace biblical authority with. Because they don't want to just bag the whole thing. They don't want to think that when they die, that is just totally it. They want to think that when they die, there's something else out there. There is an afterlife. But they reject the idea that the truth about this afterlife is in a book somewhere or is in a religious authority, because their culture has told them to reject that idea. And history, the transition out of the modern world into the postmodern world, has trained them to reject that idea. But they still want it. If I can rabbit trail here in biblical speak, it's the God-shaped void in every human heart that Paul talks about in Romans 1. That's what that is. There's a sense, even if you can't define it and you don't know what to fill it with, there's a sense that you know it's there. You know something's missing. But again, the culture has sort of beaten one answer out of you. And this is what people are left with. Again, and when you turn inward, then what's right and wrong is really determined by you and your circumstances, and you may have the best of motives. But maybe it's just time to end my marriage. Maybe it's just time to do this or that. Maybe it's okay if I steal a little bit here from the company, and I don't really have any alternative, and I'll put it back, and I'll do this and I'll do that. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to rationalize decisions. And maybe I'm doing it to give to somebody else, or I'm doing this thing that someone would call evil so that someone over here will benefit. Again, your ethics just sort of gets contorted. And that's pretty much what you're left with. You want the feeling of knowing God, whatever that is, or whoever that is, but you don't want any sort of disciplining of your thoughts and your thought processes with this crazy notion of biblical authority. That bugs you. Again, truth to the postmodern is individual and internal. There's an appeal to experience. It sounds like Oprah, doesn't it? Oprah, the systematic theologian. I mean, this is from her textbook on theology. It's from Eckhart Tolle's textbook on theology, which was big in Oprah's book club. But this is where they're at. I mean, how many times have you heard this stuff? I mean, these are catchphrases now. They're buzzwords. You hear them everywhere. And when you hear them, don't think, boy, this person's really a flake. Or, man, this person just is like one brick short of a load, Don't think that. What you should think is, they're looking. Okay? There's a void there, and they're searching. They're trying to fill it. Okay? I know what the void is, and that's actually like, it should be a signal to you that this person is ripe for discussion. Even though they're going to resist, they're going to fight you the whole way, we all know that that's true. But that person is ready for a discussion because they know something is missing. This is just, people are trapped in this. So for the postmodern is someone not troubled by ambiguities. Why? Because they don't think anything is ever really true for sure. You will not be able to convince someone that their thought processes are incorrect and yours, what you're trying to tell them, is. You have to lead them in such a way so that they draw their own conclusion. Okay, this is why I say you must insist on coherence. Okay, New Age, postmodern guy. I mean, I do this all the time on the radio. If any of you ever heard me do a radio interview, I do this all the time with people who ask questions. Well, Mike, I think this, I read this thing on, here's the next slide. You might have 2 degrees, but I read something on Wikipedia. And I get these questions, and what I like to do is say, well, that's kind of interesting. I said, you know what I would need for me to abandon my position and adopt what you're saying? I need this, and I need this, and I need this, and I need this, and I need this. If you can give me coherent reasons for why this makes sense to you, why this orders your world well, okay, why this is coherent in your life and it would make the world a better place. And it would just make sense to everybody if they just discovered this thing you want me to believe. If you can give me the grocery list of the 5 or 6 things I need to come to your side, then you got me. And if people really do that, you know what usually happens, and again in my experience, is most of them won't do that, because they'll get about one question in and they'll know, like, oh boy, I have no idea why I think that. And then that either scares them, and it's like, I don't want to talk to that guy anymore. Who's George Norrie having on next, tomorrow night? I don't want to talk to that guy anymore. Or it'll click. And it might take more. It might take 10, 15, 20, 100 conversations. But you just keep coming back to them. Well, I want to believe that. You're a nice guy. You're a nice girl. I don't think there's anything sinister going on here. I'd love to believe that. But you know what? Here's where I stumble. I don't understand it for this reason, this reason, this reason, this reason, this reason. Can you clear that up for me? And if you can, I'm with you. I know that the 5 or 6 things that I gave them have no basis in rational thought. I know that. That's the dirty little secret. I know that what they believe cannot be proven through any real data. They believe it because it sounds good. They heard it somewhere and it helped them feel good at a certain point in their life. That is why they believe it. They don't believe it for any objective reason. And so what I'm trying to get them to stumble across is that fact. I don't know why I believe that, because somebody said it on TV. And if you have a conversation with people and they tell you that, it's like, well, don't take this wrong, but do you believe everything you hear on TV? I mean, do you believe everything that guy says? Like, does that work over here and over there? And, I'm not suggesting you do this in a surreptitious, deceptive way. Okay, because when I try to do this to people, I'm being totally honest. If you really can do this, if you can really provide the data for that and it answers all these questions, well, yeah, you win. I want to know. What I'm suggesting to you is that don't shy away from people who oppose what you believe. Engage them in conversation. You will discover a lot about why people believe the stuff they believe. Don't consider it a threat. It is not a threat. It is a step in the right direction. They want to have the conversation. So don't get scared by postmodernism. Now in our culture, what comes next? Well, if we're like the postmoderns now, then what's going to happen next? Well, it's already happening. We're living in a post-Christian era, whether we like to admit it or not. That pretty much is where we're at. We have lots of doctrine-less religion, even in our churches. We have lots of faith talk, but we have very little doctrine. And when I think of doctrine, I think of people being able to explain why they believe what they believe with Scripture. That's all doctrine is. I am convinced, and not just because I got nearly 200 people looking at me here, which is, I'll be honest, I didn't expect to get 200 people. So I consider this a rebuke to me. I do. But I will tell you this, even though I didn't expect a big audience, I am convinced that the average person in the pew is dramatically underestimated by pastors. We assume that people have a low tolerance for content. Okay, a lot of them do, I'll admit that, but a lot of them don't. A lot of them, they couldn't tell you the last time they got hit by content. They might not know what it feels like, but then when they do get hit by it, a lot of people don't reject it. A lot of people don't say, well, that was a waste of time Sunday morning. A lot of people think like, wow, I never saw that before. That's really interesting. There's something here to think about. What do you know? That's what I mean, again, by doctrine. Just being able to to coherently explain why it is you believe what you believe. And yeah, it goes back to the Bible, and your question is, well, why do you believe that? Well, that, we'll talk about some of the presumptions, the presuppositions that go with it. But what I see in Christianity is basically you have three things happening. There's a resistance to the modern world as we know it, which is really the postmodern culture. And that's where I would put something like fundamentalism in there. Sort of just a resistance to really engaging any of this stuff, and a lot of proof texting. As much as I think that's a flawed approach, I'm appreciative of it because they're trying to hold on to something rather than just bagging it. So I can appreciate that. Some want to challenge modernity, again, the culture, and this is also a good thing, even though it creates turmoil within churches. To try to, what's the best way to build bridges to people who come and visit our church, or people out there that our church members meet. What's the best way to do that? We want to do that. We might have to change the way we do certain things, but we're not giving up the identity of the faith. We're not going to do that. We're drawing a line there, but we need to think creatively about how to do what we do and also how to articulate what it is we believe. Maybe do a better job of that. That's good. But then you have another group that basically they acquiesce. And they pardon the pun, they have a facade of Christianity about them, but it's unrecognizable when you get to talking about what it is they really believe. I want to focus on these two, and really mostly the last one in what's left of this session and as we keep going. Both strategies, let me go back, both those who want to challenge modernity and keep orthodoxy and those who have abandoned orthodoxy, they both use the term emergent. And that's, again, a problem for lots of people because you go and visit churches, you talk to other Christians, you don't quite know where they're at. Again, the bad part of it is you define the faith out of existence. And what you're left with is what I would call evangelical paganism. Now, I don't mean paganism like we all dress up in robes like druids and we, hey, is this the year that church is going to start that annual trip to Stonehenge and then we all get to dance around? And I'm not talking about paganism like that. I'm talking about paganism in the sense that truth is now something that is internal. Truth is found by connecting ourselves and appreciating nature. Truth is found in relationships and appreciating the synchronicities of life. I hate that term, by the way, synchronicities, because you know what it is? It's a replacement for providence. Okay, I hate that term. Okay, that's out of my system now. But this is what it is. It's all this sort of relational mumbo jumbo stuff, and then we have to throw in the name of Jesus here and there so that people don't conclude that we're not really Christians anymore. And that's what you're left with. I see too much of that happening as well. Again, we replace, activism with doctrine. Now, I want to say before we wrap up, I want to say a couple of things. I don't want to leave you hanging about just addressing the criticisms of postmodernism and the way it sort of attacks really thinking, the way it sort of attacks, yes, traditional Judeo-Christianity, but also some of its claims. Now, I would to try to make this a little practical, I'll just jump in. I might have to pardon myself with a few illustrations here, but I think they're good. I would say, first of all, that the whole notion that you're going to meet many people out there, again, don't tell me that something is true and other things are not true. That's just not fair, it's not good, it's not politically correct, whatever you want to call it. The idea that everything is uncertain, the denial of certainty, is self-defeating in life. It's unlivable. No one lives like that. That I can't believe what I'm hearing. I can't believe what you're saying because there's no such thing as certainty. No one believes that. No one really lives it. Communication is impossible if that's where you're coming from. I would say, illustration. Show me the postmodernist who walks into the hairdresser and doesn't assume that what they're asking for you to do to their hair is understood. Okay, when you go into the hairdresser and say, hey, I want this and that and the other thing, you assume that your communication to that person is just fine. And you assume that they hear it, and you feel certain that they hear it, and you're okay with that. How many people walk into their urologist, okay, and say, hey, doctor, you know what I'm here for procedurally? I would doubt that you could find anyone that thinks that they're going to come out with something other than what they went in with. Okay, but if you're a postmodern, this is what you're asked to believe. You're asked to believe that communication, successful communication, accurate communication is just impossible. Or it's so hopelessly uncertain, and I can't successfully interpret anything. I'm not omniscient, so I'm just going to throw it all out. You don't live that way. You don't live that way when you go to a restaurant. You don't live that way when you discipline your kids. You don't live that way when you fill out your tax form. You don't live that way when you call the helpline to some appliance that doesn't work. Nobody lives this way. But it sounds so good. You know why? Because no one will admit they're omniscient, because you're not. We all know that we're not omniscient, so, well, he's right. I can't really know everything. So I guess I shouldn't believe anything. That's what postmodernism asks you to believe. It's insane. It just doesn't conform to reality as every person knows it to be. So the whole assumption is just dumb. Now, I wouldn't say that to a postmodern person. I'd try to find a better way to say that. But the whole thing is just dumb. It's unlivable. So imperfect interpretation is livable. Okay, requiring omniscience or total certainty is just not. I think it's the either-or fallacy on steroids. That, again, without omniscience, I can't know anything. And I shouldn't act like I can know anything for sure. And I should just say whatever anybody says is equally good. Really? I mean, do you ever go through, not even 24 hours, you ever go through like 2 hours of your day really living that out? You don't. No one does. So I would put it this way, just because we don't know everything doesn't mean that we don't know anything. To conclude otherwise, again, I would, if it's bad Mike, he would say, go ahead and show me that. I want to see you live that out for just an hour. But if I'm in a better mood, it's like, look, have you ever really thought about what this asks you to believe and how it asks you to live? It just doesn't work. And not only that, it's just not necessary. When you go home and your spouse tells you that he or she loves you, do you quake with fear because you're a postmodern person? Do you sit there and think, well, I just can't know. I can't know. Maybe I should just divorce, and go live on an island somewhere where it's just me. It's just absurd. But this is really what the whole approach asks you to accept. Because you can't know everything, then you can't know anything. It's unlivable. It's really what it comes down to. So as far as religious claims go, I would say that religious claims, pick any one from any religion, they can be tested. Okay, they're not discoverable with the tools of science. We didn't dig that up. We didn't put it under a microscope. But they can be tested for coherence. So let's test yours. Let's test mine. We're going to play fair here. Which one makes more sense? You get theism and very specific ideas that extend from it. What we believe is actually really simple. We believe things like, okay, what makes more sense? That there's a God or not? And we're not talking about, oh, is it 24-hour day creation? Is it day age creation? Who cares, okay? Does it make more sense to have a God or not? Well, I would say, of course, that it does, and I have reasons for saying that it does. Things that can be tested, ideas that can be tested. But you could do something like this. The person you're talking to says, well, I think it makes more sense that we don't have a God. Well, why? Well, look at science. This is always where the conversation is going to go. Look at science. Well, can you explain to me, and this is a real question. I'm not poking people in the eye. It's a serious question. Can you explain to me why there are thousands today, maybe even tens of thousands of scientists who went to the same universities as the scientists you like that don't believe any of this, that don't believe in God? They went to the same universities, they had the same professors, they have the same degrees, they write for the same journals, they belong to the same academic societies, and yet they draw a different conclusion. Can you explain why that is? Think about the limited number of answers that person has now. Well, I just don't believe that. Well, walk them down to a Christian university and introduce them to the physics faculty. Okay? There's any number of places you can go. And yeah, there are that many, because if you go to the American Scientific Affiliation or the Council of Christian Colleges and Universities and look up all the schools that belong to that, and there's a few hundred of them, and let's say they each have 10 scientists in all the fields of the sciences, do the math. Okay, it really is that many. It really is. It's easy for me to quantify my assertion. Well, I just don't believe that. That isn't really an answer. I already know what you believe and don't believe. But what I want you to do is explain why this is the case. Well, they're all lying. Can you show me the study that verifies that? Can you provide me empirical, hint, scientific proof for that? Show me your work. Show me the data. It is not adequate for you to just tell me you believe something. The fact that you can articulate it does not make it true. I want to know why you are parked on this idea. Can you show me that? Another question. Why is it that we've been discussing this question, for millennia, but even in the modern era and the postmodern era, and you still have lots of people that believe that it makes more sense that there's a God than not? Why is that? See, the point is, if you can't empirically explain that, then you either have to be honest or dishonest. The honest answer is, well, the alternative, the view that I want them to embrace, might be true. It's on the table. The dishonest answer is just to walk away. Once you believe there's a God, well, can God do anything? If we believe in a God and we talk about creation, and there's lots of scientists that believe God is creator, again, regardless of evolution or whatever, they're there, some really famous ones too. So we have to assume that this God can do stuff and that he's actually interested in doing stuff. So is it possible that he could look at humanity and sort of influence somebody to write something down today? Or prepare them for their life, throughout their lives, for a moment when he can use another person or the Spirit to prompt them to write something down. I'd like it preserved for posterity. It may sound kind of squirrely to somebody living 2,000 years from now. That's okay. Get it down. Can a God do that? I can do that, okay? I can influence somebody to write something down. I mean, these are really simple ideas. Could a creator God become incarnate? If he has power over creation, could he resurrect someone who's dead, even if it's him incarnate while he exists somewhere else? Could he do these things? Again, it's a simple set of ideas. And until you can topple the first one, you really don't have anything. So again, postmodernism, when you go through it, it sounds kind of impressive, like they've really got you. You know, and the only reason that you feel that way is because you know that you don't know everything. So you feel like you got to go along for the ride. You don't. The fact that you don't know everything doesn't mean that you don't know anything. No one lives that way. Ask people to show you their work. Ask people to tell you how they live out what they believe. And again, don't be nasty about it. You're not trying to poke them in the eye. Get them to explain it to you. And probe them a little bit. Ask them questions. Have a conversation. All right, the first session, again, that was pretty general. Just to sort of, again, I'm not telling you anything that I haven't told myself as far as just dealing with people and thinking about what it is they say and why they say it. And again, I have a bit of obviously my training is biblical studies, but I also have some degrees in history. And so I always try to put things in historical perspective and ask myself, why do people think this way? I mean, ideas are important. In some ways, they just transcend culture. You never know what's going to take hold, but once it takes hold, there will be people who sort of have a vested interest in making sure that they're spread. And again, postmodernism is one of those things I think that we can all sort of recognize. We may not have a label for it. We've all sort of experienced how people think and maybe not necessarily be able to process why they're thinking a certain thought or a certain way. But just generally, if that's where people are at, they are, again, inclined to either just reject the whole concept of something being true or, again, opting for this nebulous thing that we call spirituality, this looking to within and, again, sort of experience-based struggle for truth. And I put this slide up in the last session that within Christianity, again, we have essentially three responses. There's total resistance to anything modern. There's challenging the current modernity, but trying to maintain orthodoxy. And then there's this adaptation or acquiescence that I think we're seeing too much of. And I want to focus on that in a general way, but actually go into something more specific, because post-Christian Christianity, again, is really this, there's not a whole lot new about it. And I use the term evangelical paganism for that. And again, I don't mean, wacky, human or animal sacrifices, and again, the more bizarre elements that we would associate with paganism. Again, what I'm talking about, especially in current culture, when I talk about pagan spirituality, is really two things. And I'm using terminology here that you may not be familiar with as far as the first one of these, and that is paganism is inherently monistic. And what that means, that's a nice philosophical term you can impress your friends with. For those of you who are single, it's a good way to repel. Having any prayer of a date with somebody, but trust me, I know. Monism is the idea that all is one. Okay, we're familiar with monopoly, words like that, where we have that mono, syllable or syllables in them, that prefix. Monism is this notion that we've all heard in our culture somewhere, that all is one. Everything that is real is essentially interconnected and related. There is no external reality beyond, again, this sort of self-sustaining life cycle. Monists deny that there is a creator, because a creator is distinct from creation. A creator is external to creation. There's a firm distinction between the creator and the thing created. So if you are a monist, you're going to believe things like, well, if there is a God, it's sort of embedded, it's not a personal deity, it's embedded in nature. And there's this sort of symbiotic relationship between nature and God. They're really synonyms. You could really replace one with the other in any given sentence, because all is one. Okay, we may not believe, again, that science has all the answers. We might be looking for mystery and anomalies and all this sort of stuff. But you run into monism pretty quickly when you're relating to people who are trying to be spiritual in our current culture. Again, if you're the materialist atheist, you could believe in a Big Bang, and that, are you a monist then? Well, if you've kept up with Stephen Hawking or watched the movie or whatnot, even a guy like Hawking has tried to argue against a specific single causation, like a Big Bang, that's sort of illusory. And you get ideas like the self-sustaining, self-creating universe, terms like biocosm. When you hear those things, that's monism. That is that's taking the concept of a creator and swapping in creation for it. That is inherent to paganism. Okay, it's also quite antithetical to all of your major book religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and whatnot. But the language that we use, even within Christianity, again, my concern is that people are starting to say things and traffic in ideas, and they don't really realize what their roots are and really what they're saying and where certain things lead. But none of this is new. I'm going to show you that it isn't new. All of these things about a monistic worldview, about looking within for truth, and then sort of sprinkling Jesus on it, is actually very old. We're going to talk about Gnosticism today, or in this session. It's a term that many of you have heard, and I'm willing to say that there aren't many of you that really understand what it is. Gnosticism was a significant threat to what we would think of as Orthodox Christianity. And the reason for it is because it looked so Christian. But it had certain aspects of it. It took certain turns that it was anything but, again, what we would think of as Orthodox Christianity. And so I want to use Gnosticism as an ancient example of the kinds of talk, again, the sort of spirituality that we hear in our world and even in our churches today. And again, just because it sounds like Jesus, it sounds Christian, doesn't really mean it is. You need to probe things a little bit to know where people are coming from. So, having said that, again, if we're looking at our current system, current way of thinking, and we look at Gnosticism, you'll find that Gnosticism would really be familiar, or not familiar, but friendly toward, you might use familiar in some sense, but friendly toward these ideas that are current with postmodernism, the lack of certainty. Don't appeal to authority, don't appeal to a book for truth. The whole notion that, yes, there's something beyond this material world, and that's the thing that's really important. There's something out there that we need to embrace, that we're all a part of. It's part of us, we're part of it. We need to be awakened and enlightened to this relationship we have with the cosmos. All these different sort of ideas that you hear about. And the reason I'm focusing a little bit on Gnosticism is because Gnosticism is really what fuels a lot of science fiction today. A lot of what you see on TV, a lot of what you see in film, comic books, that sort of thing. And I want to, in the next 2 sessions, sort of explain what it is and then see where it shows up. Again, and the whole idea here is not that, well, we should go out and we should shun, we should never, throw the TV away and, never watch don't watch Captain America anymore or whatever, That isn't the point. The point is that you need to know what you're looking at, and you need to be able to sort of parse what any media is trying to do to you, is trying to, what it's trying to convey. And, teach people what they're looking at so that they can, appreciate it for what it is, but also beware of things that it says that you really don't want. So let's go into Gnosticism here. By the way, this is Blake's. Henry Blake was very Gnostic in his thinking, and his image here of the Maker is kind of familiar. You may have seen it before. But let's get into what Gnosticism says and what it is. Every system of belief thinks that it has questions it wants to answer and would assert that we have the best answers for this or that thing. So Gnosticism is no different. What does it seek to provide? What spiritual help does it offer? Everything I'm going to show you, I took from this book, and there's a reason why I took it. Gnosticism by Stephan Heller. Heller is a Gnostic. He's a scholar. He has a PhD in the humanities. He is a Gnostic bishop that practices today. He has a website that's actually very useful if you want to learn about Gnosticism. In other words, what I'm going to give you now is not a caricature. It's straight from the horse's mouth. This is what Gnosticism is, and you'll see it again in the next session where it shows up in unpredictable places. Gnosticism is a theology based on something called gnosis, which is just a term that means knowledge. The knowledge of transcendence arrived at by way of interior intuitive means, inner enlightenment. Knowing God, this transcendent thing, and we'll talk about what is God in Gnosticism, is not achieved by external revelation. So a Gnostic would say, you don't get truth from a book or from an external thing called inspiration. You get knowledge based upon an individual experience of enlightenment. It requires an awakening. You say, well, that sounds kind of weird, but it's sort of innocuous. Well, we'll see. Gnosticism suggests that there's something we don't know that needs to be known, and that something is Gnosticism's story. And it's Gnosticism's story that explains what a Gnostic Christian, because Gnosticism became a sect of Christianity. That's how close of a relationship it has to it. It also has elements of Judaism in it too. Its story produced its own version of what salvation is. And again, it was very popular in the ancient world and is certainly popular today. It fundamentally recognizes, now see if this doesn't resonate with you, earthly life is filled with suffering. Okay, we can't deny that. All forms of life consume each other, thereby visiting pain, fear, and death upon one another. But whether that be animals or human beings, living things do bad things to other living things. The world is just sort of in a downward spiral. Natural catastrophes bring further suffering and death in their wake, and something just isn't right about the world. The world isn't what we'd want it to be. Can I hear an amen? A Gnostic, would easily be able to get you sort of on their side, like, well, nodding, well, yeah, everybody knows this stuff's true. Many religions advocate that humans are to be blamed for the imperfections of the world. Christianity has this thing called the fall, human imperfection, that sort of thing. Judaism, of course, Christianity known for that. Gnosticism rejects that idea entirely. I'll put on my Gnostic hat here, you are not to blame for how awful the world is. No human is to blame for how bad the world is. Just the terrible, seemingly endless spiral of destruction and pain and suffering. We all know that it's real. But those other Christians out there and the Jews would have you believe that the circumstances we find ourselves in are due really to our own failures. That's not the case. Which should, of course, raise in your mind, well, what do you say it is? Gnosticism argues that blame for the world's failings lies not with humans, but with the Creator. It's just the way the world is because that's the way the world's made. Since, especially in the monotheistic religions, the Creator is God, the Gnostic position appears to sound bad, sound blasphemous. But you have to realize what Gnostics mean when they talk about God, the God of the Bible, and a phrase like the true God. Here's the Gnostic story. There was an ultimate beginning, of everything when there was nothing else but the true God. Doesn't that sound like what we believe? There was a time when there was nothing else but God. Okay? A Gnostic says, well, that's a good place to start, and we're going to call that being that existed before there was anything else the true God, sort of the ultimate God, pre-existent, uncaused, perfect being, sort of just light, just energy, light, that kind of thing. Okay? Ask yourself how many Christians you know in your church would buy some of this as we go on. Now, the true God in Gnostic thinking had both male and female aspects. Oh, I don't believe that, Mike. That's the end of the road for me. Really? God created humankind, male and female, He created them. Well, aren't all humans reflective of God's nature? Aren't we all divine imagers? Well, we know God doesn't have a body. It's not biological, but there are aspects of God that are enhanced in females and enhanced in males. And our ultimate source is God anyway. So there's really no harm in affirming this because, gender is more than just biology. Okay? So I can try to win you over with that point. So the true God has both male and female aspects. Besides, male and female is sort of needed for creation. Now, we're not talking about a god and a goddess, the male and female, so we're not doing that. That would be bad. We're talking about something a little bit different. Now, eventually, the true God, who you could think of as father and mother sort of combined, because the true God's going to do something with an act of creation. The true God brings forth many, what the Gnostics called emanations, sort of producing parts or pieces of itself, bringing forth life out in the cosmos. Now, these are not human beings yet. It's something else. But there are emanations. And I've colored them blue and white because they're spoken of in terms of gender. There's also another name given to them in Gnostic literature, and that is aeons. These are divine beings. These are, dare I say, the sons and daughters of God. God's non-human divine family. See, Gnostics talk about the same sort of thing. Again, because they're familiar with Scripture, but they're not going to assign certainty to truth claims in this thing we call the Bible. But yet the concepts are still there. So these other divine beings are sort of part of the true God, and God sort of puts them out there. The true God puts them out there. Some have God sort of blowing himself up, and then the pieces become the eons, and the others say, well, the eons were produced and the true God is still sort of there somehow, or at least part of him, whatnot. Get a little bit of difference there. When the eons are collectively assembled, using that language out of necessity, if you put all the eons back together, they would be what's called in Gnosticism the pleroma, the fullness. Well, that makes sense, because if they all come from the true God, when you put them all back together, they would be the fullness of the true God. Doesn't Paul talk about the fullness of God and all that kind of stuff? Sure he does. Now let's replace them with, we'll give them a little personality here, male and female. We've got the aeons, and their realm is distinct from ours. The created universe and the material world as we know it doesn't exist at this point. So what the true God is doing is creating a staff, creating a household, creating a family. Again, stick with the sons and daughters of God idea. And the aeons sort of just are drifting out there in the universe, doing whatever the true God would want them to do and acting on his behalf. But the universe as we know it doesn't exist yet. That has to come later. The heaven and earth, the material world that we experience, isn't around yet. Now, one of these aeons in the Gnostic story, a female aeon, her name was Sophia. Okay? And Sophia is in Gnostic literature often cast as a redhead, so I picked the redhead. Plus, I like red hair. So Sophia says, I want to be like the true God. He's a creator. I want to create stuff too. And whereas the true God had this male and female aspect that enabled creation, Sophia is just a female, and so she doesn't have a counterpart. And so the rest of the eons are like, this is a dumb idea. You shouldn't do that. Did you check with the boss? And she's like, well, this is a good thing. I just want to be like him. So I want to create something too. Let me alone. There's a bit of rebellion here. So Sophia decides, I'm going to create a being. And the being that she creates is known in Gnosticism as the demiurge. Anybody know what demiurge means? It means the maker, the creator, the one who fashions. So she creates the demiurge, the maker. And the maker creates heaven and earth as we know it. See, Sophia's creation is the God of the Bible. He is the maker. Now, unfortunately, because Sophia didn't check with the boss and sort of went out on her own to do this, it doesn't go really well. The demiurge is kind of a nutcase, sort of a sociopath, psychopath, not a good guy. See, in the Gnostic system, Earth is the way it is because the demiurge made it that way. There is evil because that's just a byproduct of what he is. That's why there's suffering. So when Sophia creates the demiurge says, well, I can do that too. Watch me. And so he creates heaven and earth, and he creates some helpers too. Now, I made them look sinister because they are. In Gnosticism, these are the archons. Paul talked about them too. These are the rulers, the principalities, and the powers. The demiurge, the maker, made them to just be nasty. Now, they actually have a role, and it's not a good one, because the demiurge also creates humanity. Now, in the Gnostic story, human beings are created to be essentially slaves. They don't have really any spirit, any sort of the breath of, like we would think of biblically, the breath of God, any sort of, good immaterial part that would make them seek God. They're just sort of like biobots, sort of like mindless slaves, robots. Or if you're an ancient astronaut theorist, okay, this is Zecharia Sitchin right here with his myth about the Anunnaki. It's just warmed over Gnosticism. Sorry, but that's what it is. It's Gnosticism applied to Mesopotamian material that really knows nothing about it. But anyway, it's a little sidebar. So Sophia's looking at this and going, well, this isn't what I intended. This is awful. She pities the humans. It's like they're just going to, what kind of life is that? They're basically just brute slaves to serve this awful thing that I made. I got to do something. This just isn't right. And so what Sophia does, and by the way, Sophia means wisdom, again, rational knowledge, intellect, that kind of thing. More particularly wisdom. Sophia says, I need to put a little bit of myself, because I'm an eon. I mean, I'm good, but I know I did the bad thing here, by rebelling and doing, creating when I shouldn't have, and I'm sorry, but what I am, the true God is, and that's good. So I'm going to take some of what's in me, and I'm going to sneak it in to humans. There's a little spark of divinity in every human being. This is where that idea comes from. I'm going to put a little bit of myself in there because that will give them a mind so that one day, hopefully, they will awaken to understand who they are. And we'll get to who they are more specifically in a moment. So Sophia tries to do the good thing, and that's where we get the human condition. Now, what we saw just feels a little dualistic because the Maker's the one who creates the heaven and earth. But you have to realize that that's just part and a byproduct of something that was made of the true God's essence. So Gnosticism actually isn't dualistic. It's actually monistic, because there were plenty of Gnostics that taught that the world that we, and this is probably how the average person in church thinks of Gnosticism when it comes up in a sermon. Gnostics had a very low view of the material world. Well, wouldn't you if the demiurge made it? I mean, who wants to say that guy did a good job? Okay, so they had a very low view of the materiality, including their own bodies, and so some of them were aesthetics and things like that. But Gnostics really taught that the material world that you think you live in is actually an illusion. It's a disguise. It's something to blind you to who you are.
Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. Do you know what I'm talking about?
The Matrix.
Do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work. when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
What truth?
That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind.
It's a facade. It is a misdirection. It's a distraction. What you need to realize is that, again, the world that we experience isn't really ultimately reality. Now, don't Christians talk that way too? I mean, the material, the world that we live in, this isn't really our home, this is all going to fade and pass away. And when it does, there'll still be something there, and that's even more real than this world is, and all this kind of thing. Again, it's very similar, but the angle it's coming from is quite different. So, Gnosticism, again, says what it says to explain why the world is the way it is. And that brings up the whole idea of salvation. Well, what is salvation to a Gnostic then? I mean, if this is the way we are, and this is what we were made, what does that mean? What does that mean in theology? How did that compete with Christianity? Well, one of the eons was named the Christos, which means Christ, right? This eon said, you know what? We see what Sophia has done, and it was a good thing that she put a little bit of herself in every human being, and, hopefully they'll sort of wake up one day and realize that they're divine, just like we are. And they'll get hope that the world they live in will pass away, and eventually their spirit, the part that comes from Sophia, will make its way back to us to rejoin the true God, and everything will be all in all. I'm deliberately using Pauline phrases here, by the way. But, there are things we can do to sort of take care of the situation. So one of the eons, the Christos, says, I'm going to go to earth, and I'm going to, Gnostic theologies differ here, I'm either going to manifest myself as a man, or I'm going to inhabit a man. Again, Gnostic theologies don't always agree here, just like Christian theologies don't always agree. But the effect is the same. There's this Jesus guy that enters the picture. And what's Jesus' message? Well, his message is to reveal the light, to reveal gnosis, to transmit and spread knowledge. And this one comes from Ben-Hur, that there is God in every man. If you've ever seen Ben-Hur, that line is in that movie. It's the Roman procurator that says it. This is the message. I'm going to go to earth and try to help, try to fix this. Now, the demiurge learns about this somehow, probably because he's just the demiurge. And the archons say, well, we know what we're going to do now. We got to kill this guy. We got to get rid of him, because we know what this is about. And so that becomes the message. And again, isn't that the message of Paul in 1 Corinthians 2? Had the rulers of this world known, they would have never crucified the Lord of glory. And the Christos goes down to earth. Yes, Jesus winds up getting crucified. Christos rises to go back to the Father. Now, to the Gnostic, that's resurrection. It has nothing to do with the body of Jesus. Resurrection has to do with the Christos rejoining the Father, and the Father saying, well done. You spread the knowledge of gnosis way out there, and lots of people are going to hear your message, and in fact, the people who believed it are going to spread it, and people will realize that God is in every man. They will realize that this world is not the end. They will realize who they are, that within every person there's a spark of divinity. We are, by nature, divine. This is the message of Gnosis, but you have to be awakened to that, and Jesus was part of that. Now, this means some things for Genesis. You're probably already gravitating there. Let us create humankind as our image. In the Gnostic story, and again, this is just like ancient astronaut stuff, the archons were sort of watching the demiurge create humanity. This is cool, man. Not only do we get some help in doing stuff on Earth, but they work for us. They're our slaves. This is awesome. Sweet. That's why there's the plural there. Genesis 3, what's the role of the serpent? Here's probably the biggest difference. Well, it's not the biggest, but one you may have heard of, the difference between Gnosticism and Orthodox Christianity, biblical Christianity. What's the role of the serpent? The serpent said to the woman, you know, when you eat of that tree, you're not going to die. You will not surely die, for God knows, the Maker, the Creator, knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you'll be like God. You'll be like a God, an Elohim, knowing good and evil. In other words, you'll get gnosis. This is why he doesn't want you to eat from the tree, because you will learn who you are. You will learn about not only what you're doing here, but you'll learn about the whole history of how the Maker got here, who the Maker is, and the fact that there's this other eon out there, Sophia, who made you part of what you are. You're divine, and there's this true God out there, and your destiny is to be with him. You're going to know this stuff. You will be enlightened. In Gnosticism, the serpent is the hero of the story because he tries to enlighten humans. He tries to tell Eve, this is why God doesn't want you to do that. He doesn't want you to know. There are things that God just doesn't want you to know. And I just thought, I'm going to take a risk here, but I'm going to go tell you. So he's the hero. So in terms of summary of what a Gnostic believes, the true God and the divine creator of the world are different beings. They're different. Evil and suffering are the fault of the creator, the demiurge. Humanity was created but has a spark of the true God in each human by means of Sophia. Salvation for humans, therefore, is not deliverance from sin. When Eve eats and then Adam eats, they're doing a good thing. They listened to the serpent and they did get enlightened. And a Gnostic would say they didn't die, did they? Who was right in the story? Looks like the serpent was right, doesn't it? Because they don't just drop over dead, do they? So there is no sin. The reason the world is what it is not because of what Adam and Eve did. What Adam and Eve did was the reason that you can be enlightened. You should thank them. And thank the serpent, by the way, too. We got to give him credit. Without them, you would have no hope of recovering the knowledge of who you are. And the reason bad things happen to people, and there's such wickedness and evil and suffering in the world, is because that's the way God made it, and he likes it. It entertains him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have done it. Now, this takes you right into the whole question of why is there evil? Gnosticism strikes at the heart, in terms of biblical theology, of why there is evil. And, we have our sort of pet answers for this. Orthodox Christianity does. Some that are high Calvinists would say, well, God just, there's evil because that was something God decreed, and God decreed the fall, and this is the way God wanted to do it because he wanted to also show himself gracious by sending Jesus, and it's just terrible that humans have to suffer because of what God decided, but there is a solution. Again, the high Calvinist view, God predestines everything. And if you're consistent, you got to say predestined the fall. But people don't like that. So they'll say, well, God predestines everything except evil. Evil's just part of God's plan. So in other words, for the whole universe to work out the way God wanted it to, that child needed to be raped. Like God couldn't think of a better way to do it. He had to include that. He has to include tsunamis. Fill in the blank. That's actually what that view suggests, even though people who articulate that don't want to say that. But it implies that this is the best thing that God could imagine, the best way for life to go, and it just includes all this garbage. That's the best God could do. He doesn't cause it, but he needs it for things to work out. Now, if you're in either one of those two views, you're in trouble with a Gnostic. Let's just be blunt about it. Because what they're going to say just sounds a whole lot more reasonable. Because what they're going to say is, you know what? You don't like my system because I say that the Creator is evil. Well, guess what, dude? Your Creator's evil too. You just haven't admitted it yet. You just haven't acknowledged it. Do the right thing and own it, and then we can talk. Now, I don't believe either of those things. Those of you who know me, you know that I'm not in either of those camps. But Gnosticism sort of goes for the jugular at this point. The whole issue of theodicy is really crucial to talking with a Gnostic or someone who's really steeped in it and knows the systems and really knows theology pretty well. That's going to be really one of those, you got to deal with that before you're really going to deal with most everything else. So humanity, their problem isn't sin. The problem is that they're blinded. They need to be awakened. They need to be awakened to their destiny, return to the true source. Now here we're going to sound real Oprah-ish. The true source of human consciousness. We need to journey back to the cosmos. We need to meet our Maker. We can all be one because everybody's one. Everything's one. Everybody's going to join the true God. There is no hell. There is no sin. Good grief. This is what you hear at any given channel, Sunday morning or regardless. This is the theology of our time. And when you sprinkle Jesus on it, good grief, I want to believe that. I want to have I want to be honest with why there's evil, and I want to know that, hey, when I die, it may not just be all this churchianity stuff, but there's an afterlife, and I'm going to join the true God after all. I had this near-death experience and all this kind of stuff, and I saw the light, and I'm not making light of all near-death experiences. But a lot of what is peddled in that regard is just right out of this playbook. And you know what? It helps people. It makes them feel better. And that's what people are looking for. And they're looking at your explanation for evil. And if the Gnostic was in the room and says, you know what, we really say the same thing. He just hasn't admitted God's evil. I have. I'm going to be more honest with you. But I do believe there is a Christ, and I do believe he came to earth, and I do believe he went back to the Father. I'm just going to give you a better explanation. This is why it was such a threat. It attacked certain points of Christianity where it was most vulnerable, at least in the way things were getting articulated. Now, in terms of transitioning to part 2, all of this is a narrative that has been refiltered and repackaged to you and to me through modern media, through science fiction. Space is now the new heaven. Okay, think about that. When you strip heaven of God, or the God of the Bible, because he's either evil or you don't think he exists, then heaven is just outer space. And in the Gnostic narrative, that's where the true God, he exists beyond that anyway. We need to sort of seek some reunification. And some would say that, well, I want to keep some of the Bible, or, I want to keep at least some of the stories. And so they begin to swap in their own deities, the 21st century's own version of deities. And that's naturally the extraterrestrial, because they're all beyond humanity. If you actually read some of their literature, they will refer to the extraterrestrial as the eons. I mean, this is just right out of the playbook. The Urantia book, it's nothing more than warmed over Gnosticism and Theosophy. Again, it's a popular narrative. Our knowing where we came from, knowing where we're supposed to go, knowing that we are really divine, that we can transcend this life and our own humanity, we will get all those answers if we make contact. We'll get all the answers. They'll not only help us on our problems here, clear up global warming and all that kind of stuff, but we'll get our ultimate answers. We will know the truth that's out there. I mean, this is an easy substitution for a 21st century audience that is just teetering on rejecting all this old creedal religious stuff anyway. So it's the solution of the human dilemma. Again, you'll often see in science fiction how the ETs want to give us Eden back, save our planet, save us. And they'll add thoughts like, hey, we really had a hand in what you are. And again, it fits the Gnostic narrative very beautifully. And oh, by the way, it's your destiny to become like us. We are living examples of what you can be and what you're destined to be. Again, if you're not moored to biblical authority and Christianity, that sounds kind of cool. If you really want to believe that it's not just atheistic materialism, that there's just something beyond that, this is kind of cool. It's appealing. And not only is it appealing sort of as a new myth, but scientists talk about this all the time. There must be something to it if scientists talk about it. It must be real, else they wouldn't be talking about it. Again, it's easy to just get caught up in it. But let's take a break.